This tutorial is about working with alpha channels within Mamba. We're likely to get our alpha channels in one of four ways. Either our image is going to come with an embedded alpha channel, for example if it's been made by a CGI or graphic program, or it's going to come with a separate matte movie or image sequence, or it's an alpha that we derive from the content of the image, for example a chroma key, or we're going to make our alpha channel by drawing around something. If the image includes an embedded alpha channel, so it's an RGB-A movie or image sequence, we can find that out quite quickly by going to View and View Alpha, and then we can see what alpha channel is associated. A clip that doesn't have an embedded alpha would normally come up as an opaque white full alpha. If we're given a separate foreground and alpha channel like this is a dust pass from CGI, so that's the foreground element of it, and that's the matte part of it. But it's been given as a separate movie, so the matte is actually in the RGB channels, not in the alpha channel. So to connect those two together, we just use the external key function. And so what the external key function will do is take RGB from input 1 and then create an alpha channel from the luminance of input 2. So now going out of the external key, we can see our RGB channels are the same as our incoming RGB, but our alpha channel is now the matte pass. Once we have an alpha channel, there are a few effects that work with that cutout. The most likely one we would use would be Comp 3D. So the word Comp 3D is actually two things added together. It's an effect that it's a compositor, and it works in a 3D environment insofar as there's a block of space with X, Y and Z coordinates. If we connect it to two things and just look at the result, by default a Comp 3D simply takes input 1 as a background image and input 2 as a foreground image. So this is my background image and this is my foreground image with the embedded alpha channel. So Comp 3D, without touching anything else, will simply put those components together. We'll have a separate tutorial on the Comp 3D functions because there are quite a few functions embedded inside it. But for now we'll just use it as a straight compositor. So simply input 1 is always the background, and then all other inputs become composited foreground layers using the alpha channel that's presented. So in this case this has the embedded alpha. Alternatively, if I connected this up, then we can see we're now getting the alpha channel from that pass as well. Note that if we took an image like this and connected this in, we can see that actually it's covered everything else up. The reason for that is that this clip currently has a full alpha channel, so we need to do something to derive an alpha channel from this clip. So let's look at some methods to create an alpha channel from the contents of the RGB channels. So I'm just going to clear down a bit. There are various different types of keyer in this column here, but in fact I'm going to go on a different route first off and go into the color corrector. The reason for that is the color corrector actually has quite a nice little interface for doing basic keying. So we'll have a quick look at that first. So all I'm going to do is go into the color corrector, and again we'll have a tutorial about the color corrector another time. We just want to look at the keying side of it. So to do that I go into Select and just tell it that I want to export my selection inside or outside. And then we'll be able to see the key that it's creating from the alpha channel here, which of course at the moment is nothing because we haven't done anything. So our keying selection tools are essentially here. So for example, if I switch on the color selector, we can see that I'm starting to create alpha channels from the colors that I find. So I'm using the left mouse button to spin that wheel around. Alternatively, I could use the hue pick. With the middle mouse button, if I click and drag, I can broaden out the color radar symmetrically. Or with the right mouse button, I can extend the range asymmetrically. So this is selecting on color alone. What I could also do is add into that selections based on saturation values and luminance values. So if I left click and drag this line up, essentially what I'm saying is to no longer include the least saturated colors. And if I were to drag this end down with the left mouse, I'm saying don't include the most saturated colors. Likewise with the luminance, the darkest colors, ignore those. Or the lightest colors. So that's with the left button. If I use the right button, then I can put some softness, some tolerance into that selection. So using a combination of these functions, we can isolate a band of colour based on its hue, its saturation and its luminance. If I turn this off, it disables the hue selection, but the others still work, so you can still use this as quite a graphic way of getting at the colour bands that you want. You can also use this graph, hold down Alt to insert a point, to alter the clipping profile of the key. So that's using the colour corrector to generate an alpha channel. So just as a reminder, if I delete this to start over, go into the Select folder and just ensure that your export key is on. Inside or outside is effectively just inverting the key. So once you've done that, you can go ahead and make your selection. So let's just look at the other keyers that are available. So I'm just going to delete that and go back to the Effects tab. So under the keyers we have presets for green screen and blue screen, and these have some specific functions that work best with green and blue screens. We'll have a separate tutorial dealing just with working with green screens, but just for now we can see that just adding a green screen, and if we look at the resulting RGB, you can see by default it'll have a go at the hue suppression, and then I can simply say that should be transparent and that should be solid. Or I can use the histogram in here to fine-tune the selection. There are some more advanced functions within the green screen keyer that we'll look at in a dedicated tutorial. We looked at external key. That was the method of tying together a separate foreground and matte. The RGB keyer is a straightforward luminance keyer based on RGB values. So just clicking it on its default values, we can see that the luminance values of the incoming clip have become the alpha channel. And so to do a straightforward luminance key, we could again make alterations on here, or perhaps make a luminance key by picking transparent and solid. In its default settings, the RGB keyer's RGB values are set to 0, which is why we're getting a straight luminance key. We could, if we wanted to, pick a particular colour using the Colour tab. See the colour's gone into there. And now we'd get a luminance key starting from the particular values that we'd set. The next key on the list is the colour key. What the colour key does is it builds an alpha channel based on a list of very specific colours that have been picked. So for example, if I switch to RGB multiplied by alpha, so in other words anything that is not full alpha will go black for the time being, and the first colour to pick would be maybe that, we can see that anything that is exactly that colour has disappeared, and maybe a second colour to pick the blue. So based on our pick list, the colour keyer then generates a histogram which we can use for fine-tuning. In most situations the colour keyer isn't the preferred way of doing a chroma key because it's looking for very precise RGB values, and obviously you can see that chroma keys generally don't have that, although it might make sense if your background is a digitally generated flat colour. The next keyer is called Luma keyer, and it's quite a simple keyer. Essentially the image range of luminance is split into 3 bands, low, mid and high, and the alpha channel is built from the components within those zones. It's completely opaque at the moment because all those zones are totally enabled. So if I switch off the low component and the high component, we can see the only contribution to the alpha channel is what's in the midtones. In most scenarios, if we were trying to do this, probably the color corrector would be the better way to go because it has more control. As you can see, we don't have control over what exactly is the low, the mid or the high. But if you did just want to quickly filter out one of those sections, for example to multiply this with noise in order to add more realistic looking grain, where the grain is strongest in the midtones and weakest in the lows and highs, then this will give you quick access to that range. If we're not generating our alpha channel based on the content of the RGB channels, then the other way to do it is to draw shapes. We'll have a dedicated tutorial, but essentially any element in nodes can have its own shape or multiple shapes, and we just draw them, and subject to settings in here we create alpha channels. But we'll have a full tutorial on the shapes separately.